differential is lowered and the impeller slows down, although, of course, it's still turning faster than it was at 1,000 feet. Your readjustment in the cockpit, of course, is made in terms of the result manifold pressure, since you have no turbo tack, no instrument for pressure differentials. But the immediate result of turbo readjustment is always a change in the pressure differential across the turbine buckets. And on airplanes equipped with the oil regulators, turbos must be readjusted constantly on the climb. But it was that little tussle with carburetor icing that got me started on this stuff. We were on instruments, plenty of altitude, maximum long-range power setting. Weather, local showers. My instructor wanted me to figure things out for myself. When our manifold pressure began to fall off, I advanced throttles a little. Not too sharp. So my friend gave me a hint. Carburetor air temperature well within icing range. I finally caught on, called for intercoolers hot and carburetor filters on. But that wasn't the whole answer. My co-pilot let me sweat a little before doing what had to be done. Full turbo boost, at the same time, back on the throttles to keep manifold pressure down where we wanted it. That guy was the silent type, but he let me know how he felt. Then he froze on the carb air thermometer for the next 2 or 3 minutes. Well, here's the straight of it. The stuff in that elbow below the fuel jet is ice. Already it's acting as a kind of secondary throttle. That's why your first warning may be a drop in manifold pressure. So defrosting's in order, but quick, before she's throttled off completely. We need heat, and drier air would help. So carburetor filters on. That's the first step. Reason? The filter's inside the wing where the air's heated up a little by the engines. Air in the wing's a little drier than outside air, too. But maybe that isn't enough. So, what about intercoolers hot? Okay. So you shut off that cold air from the outside. Just where will it get you? Suppose you're flying at an altitude where you don't need any turbo boost to maintain the manifold pressure you want. Engine blowers carrying the load alone. The turbo impeller's loafing, little or no compression taking place here. And as a result, intake air temperature is not raised noticeably. So the intercooler's hot trick isn't accomplishing a great deal. For remember, the intercooler cools only. It isn't a heater. In the hot position, it simply stops cooling. The carburetor's still in the jam, and so are you. The idea is to turn on the heat. And you have a nice fire laid right here, ready to touch off. Give her some turbo. Increase turbo RPM, turn on the heat. That gives you a higher rate of compression and raises intake air temperature. That hot intake air is being sent on to the carburetor without intercooling. However, in raising air pressure, we've also increased power, and that we don't want. So, we'll cut down that extra surge of power, manifold pressure, with the throttle. Get it down to the correct cruising value. But that, of course, cuts down pressure only. We're still getting heat in here to the ice. Result, spring thaw. And, of course, we've been a little slow about it. When you have icing conditions, use these tricks as precautions against icing. Don't wait until you're actually in trouble. And here's another trick. Under certain flight conditions, the wastegates may be nearly closed even though your turbo controls aren't all the way forward. So when you give her full boost, the increase in turbo RPM may not be great enough to give you the compression heat you need. But usually with this turbo condition, you'll be turning a fairly low engine RPM. In this case, we'll fall back on something we learned earlier, the fact that an increase in engine RPM also increases the rate of exhaust, which has the effect of speeding up your turbo. In other words, if you can't get the turbo compression heat you need with the turbo levers, you can fall back on prop pitch and get out of your jam that way. It's a good idea to consult your tech orders for the amount of turbo boost it's safe to use for this job at various altitudes. At high altitude, you have some other induction system problems to worry about. I don't think I ever put on an oxygen mask without thinking of carburetor filters. I suppose because the filter's a kind of a mask. But it's the kind that's hard to breathe through. A dust mask tied in a way of speaking over the airplane's nose. Silly, isn't it? But it's pretty obvious that intake air has a harder time getting through this filter than it does through the ram air intake. That's why when you turn filters on, manifold pressure falls off about 1.5 inches. Filter has a throttling effect, and your reaction is to give her a little more turbo. That, of course, increases turbo speed. And the turbo has a top critical RPM beyond which it isn't guaranteed structurally. If you're climbing to high altitude, carburetor filters put an extra load on the turbo that will force it to exceed its critical speed long before it should, probably at around 20,000 feet. There's another neat way of doing that, too. Open up a hole in the high-pressure side of the system. Flat's good for that, or a pre-ignition backfire will do the trick. Too rapid throttle action before the engine's warm can cause such a backfire. Whatever the cause, you will probably keep increasing turbo boost as you climb to altitude to maintain the 38 inches you need for rated power. But now you're trying to supercharge the whole substratosphere. And again, the turbo will exceed its critical RPM long before reaching 30,000 feet. Just when will depend on the size of the hole that's opened in it. But suppose your induction system's tight. You get your filters turned off at the right time and reach 30,000 as you should without trouble. If you had an instrument for practically everything, you'd find an induction system situation something like this. Manifold pressure, 38 inches. Wastegate set to back up an exhaust pressure of around 25 inches. Outside barometric pressure, approximately 9 inches. Pressure differential, 25 to 9. Turbo supercharger has reached its top safe speed. Outside air at 9 inches pressure is sucked in by the turbo impeller and compressed to 26 inches. Outside in the weather, it's 48 below. Brass monkey situation. But turbo compression makes it cozy in here. Too cozy for comfort. Downright tropical. The intercooler puts it back in the temperate zone. Passing through the carburetor venturi cools it off some more. Not enough humidity at this altitude for icing trouble. Lost a little pressure on the way. It was 26 inches back there between the turbo and the intercooler. Engine blower finishes the job, building manifold pressure up to the value needed for rated power. If you're climbing above 30,000 feet, keep an eye on the altimeter. When you reach 31,000, reduce manifold pressure 1.5 inches below the rated power value. 36.5 inches at 31,000 and another 1.5 inches for every additional 1,000 feet. The reason is that rated power can't be maintained up here without forcing the turbo to exceed its maximum safe RPM because of the low outside air pressure. Some turbos have a higher critical altitude, but the principle's the same for all 17s equipped with oil regulators. Get the principle and you'll never go far wrong in practice. Well, I guess that's the text of my sermon. My own luck changed for the better as soon as I could see what's likely to happen with a closed wastegate during the mag check. Knowing you can dam off the excessive pressure from a runaway turbo with the throttle will get you out of a lot of takeoff jams. With hydraulic regulators, decreasing barometric pressure on the climb will give you higher turbo speeds unless you readjust the position of the wastegate. When you run into carburetor icing conditions, remember the filter's inside the wing where the air is comparatively dry and warm. And that intercooler's hot won't do you any good unless your turbo's busy generating heat. Your carburetor filter's fine for dust and handy when you have carburetor icing, but it's a hard thing for an engine to breathe through and should not be used at high altitude. Damage done by pre-ignition backfire can result in turbo overspeeding at altitude. Fast throttle action before the engines are warm can do you the dirt. And reduce manifold pressure as you climb above your turbo's critical altitude. Airplanes, of course, aren't frozen. Improvements are being made constantly. Check your knowledge as often as possible against new directives and tech orders. In the end, it should all add up to a nice fat margin of safety. And to fatten that up, brother, even I'm willing to do a little bookwork.